Now, if you know me, you know that I love video games, especially old, kind of retro video games, the kind of stuff no one really cares about anymore. Some might say a bit too much, actually. And the other thing I really love is guns. I love shooting guns, I love studying the history of guns, all that jazz. And while fewer would say a bit too much, some would still say a bit too much, but there is an intersection between these two interests of mine that I happened to come across, and I never really expected, and I just need to say something about it. If you're a lot like me and just like kind of hyper autistic about video games and video game history, especially retro video games, or just kind of interested in general, like you're the kind of person who in middle school, instead of watching normal stuff on YouTube like Pokemon content or Jake Paul or, I don't know, doing your math homework, and instead you watched Angry Video Game Nerd and learned how to curse from Angry Video Game Nerd and got detention for cursing in front of the teachers. If you're like that, then you probably know about the very earliest video game consoles, the first generation. I mean, a lot of people think of old video game consoles and they think of this, the Nintendo Entertainment System. This is kind of the quintessential retro video game console. I mean, there's a reason why your grandma probably still calls everything video game related a Nintendo. Alternatively, if you want to get a bit further back, you might think of this, the Atari 2600. Now this is really what most people will think of when they think oldest video game console, if they know much about video games, because I mean there's a lot of people Gen X now in their 40s who kind of grew up with this, the first video game console, but this wasn't the first. It wasn't even the first to use cartridges. Now, the Atari 2600 was released in 1980 and is actually part of the second generation of video game consoles, the third generation being your NESs, your fourth generation being more like Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis kind of deal. But before that, and like I said, if you know a decent amount about video game history, you know that the first ever game console proper was the Magnavox Odyssey, released in 1972, I believe nearly 10 years before the Atari 2600, and it was the first video game console. Now, before that, you had, Pong consoles, plug-and-play stuff that, really just had one, maybe two games built into it that were really just variations of each other. And while the Magnavox Odyssey was similar to that, it actually had interchangeable cartridges, different games with programming on it. But the thing is, the Magnavox Odyssey didn't really have interchangeable cartridges in the way we think of them today. Now, when you think of a cartridge-based video game system, you think of, the N64, the SNES, the Sega Genesis, and that you have these cartridges, they're their whole own separate self-contained thing, and then you pull it out, you put in a new cartridge, and it's a completely different game, different engine, built from the ground up, whole different thing. But the Odyssey wasn't really that. All of the games it came with were all built into the box. They all came with the box. They had these little chips, and I'm sure I'll be showing them on screen here, but they had these little chips, and they were basically kind of variations of the hardware that was already built into the system. So while it was the first video game console, it wasn't the first true interchangeable cartridge-based system in the way we think of it today. No, for that, we actually have to skip forward, and I want to talk to you about the Fairchild Channel F, or the Channel Fun, as is its government name. Now, the Fairchild Channel F was released in '76, and in some circles, it's debatably the first true video game console. While widely it's accepted the Odyssey has that honor, the Channel F was the first console with swappable game cartridges as we'd see them today. They were sold separately. They had different games built from the ground up in different ways on them, different genres, all of that. Now, what's interesting about that, though, is Fairchild. Now, Fairchild, as you might expect, was the company that created the Channel F. And there's three possible places you could know the name Fairchild from. The first is if you're really into video games. The second is if you're really into airplanes. And the third we'll get to it in a bit. But first, let's talk about the airplanes. Now, Fairchild was originally founded by a guy named Sherman Fairchild, very creative name. And it was originally called Fairchild Camera and Instrument, which is a little bit more in tune with a company you'd expect to make a video game console, especially, pre-crash. But in 1925, wanting to, expand a little bit, the company started a subsidiary called Fairchild Aircraft. And, as you would have expected, Fairchild Aircraft made planes. Big surprise. So, 1924, Fairchild Aircraft is founded, and, a couple years later, what do you think is going on? This, a little bit of that, a lot of this. And so, obviously, they start, contracting with the U.S. government. A lot of the planes used in World War I, and especially in World War II, were made by Fairchild Aircraft, and so it's pretty safe to say they were kind of a big part of the military-industrial complex, at least relatively speaking. And, being part of the military-industrial complex, obviously they did most of their contracting for the military, especially, NATO countries, mostly the United States. And, like anyone, planes, trains, automobiles, those are all fine, but, variety is the spice of life, you want to mix things up, kind of expand your horizons. So they obviously founded part of they founded a subsidiary that made guns, and they called that little subsidiary Armalite. Now, if you're familiar at all with guns, that name sounds very familiar, and you're probably starting to put the dots together. But to spell it out, Armalite is the company that employed Eugene Stoner, the inventor of the AR-15, the Armalite Rifle 15. Meaning that the same people who revolutionized video game consoles by creating the first interchangeable cartridge system are the exact same people who created and sent rifles over to Vietnam. And so, it's a lot like how, the AR-180, they had, the handguards were being produced by Mattel. So you had the same people making Barbie dolls for kids were also making handguards for the IRA. The same people making video game consoles in the 70s were the same people machining M16s and sending them overseas to kill farm children. Fairchild. We make video games and we get in fights, right? So I don't have a Fairchild channel left to show you because I spent all my money on not this. But that was just something really funny that I just wanted to share, and this is probably the best place to do it. That being said, I do have a fairly large video coming up soon. Viewer retention just went, but I do actually have a fairly large video in the works that'll be coming out in the next month or so. So hopefully that'll stay up. But no, I just wanted to mention that. Oh my God, that's a Sega Genesis.